was really good. So we're kicking off with a story then that starts off with a miraculous birth. It's way before the story of the kings, because God said, I'm going to start a nation. And at the age of about 100, a boy was born that should never have been born. It was absolutely impossible. But miraculously, God brought the first child of Abraham to life, the first step in fulfilling the promise that he made to Abraham all those many years ago. And then came the second, Jacob and Esau. And then out of Jacob, the younger brother, as so many times there's twists and turns in the story, out of the younger brother was born 12 sons. Quite an increase from where they were, 1 to 12, and one daughter, Dinah. And those will then become the 12 tribes of Israel. And a famine came, and unbeknown to them, they sold their brother to save them from a famine. And there in Egypt, God has already made the way, and food was already prepared, and they moved into Egypt, fully knowing, because God told Jacob that your descendants will be here for 4 generations, and in the 4th generation they will come out, and I will take them to the land that I promised I'll give them. And sure enough, 4 generations later, they cried out to God because they were in slavery, and God fulfilled his promise, and he sent Moses. And Moses was already prepared for 80 years for this job. God knew what he was doing. And they went through the Red Sea after the 10 plagues, and they went into the wilderness, and they met their God at the mountain, Sinai. God came onto the mountain in all of his glory. And we said the other day, in Monique's cell group, just reminded that those same thunderbolts shooting out from God's presence, and that same voice like thunder rolling down the mountain that John would later see up in heaven, that's what they experienced. God came in all of his glory onto the mountain and met them. And so for the first time ever, there's an entire nation that audibly hears the voice of their God speaking to them all from the mountain. And it was too overwhelming for them. They said, please, Moses, you go up and you hear his voice, because we cannot bear it. And from that day on, God started guiding them, saying, this is how I will live in your midst. These are the laws that you will have as a nation. This is the way that I want you to dress. This is the way I want you to eat. This is the way your land issues will work. This is the way justice will work in your land. So he became king of the nation. He gave them laws. He gave them instruction. He said, this is how this nation will look. He formed them through all of this. And they didn't have faith in him, so they spent a longer time in the desert than they should have. But eventually, through Joshua, they came into the promised land, and God started fulfilling his promise. Pocket by pocket by pocket, he started giving them the land that he promised them they will have. And so this disinherited people got given a land, because God went ahead of them in their battles. And so many times in those battles, we saw stuff like the sun standing still, because God said, you need more time for this battle. Or literally hail raining down out of heaven, killing more of the enemy than their own army could do. So not only was God the king, but God was their defender. He was the one fighting on their behalf through all of these miraculous means. And then came the time of the judges, shortly before we kick off our story in the Kings. In the time of the judges, they forget all these things about God. And so they start making compromises. All of these people that still stay in the land, they got lazy. And the book of Judges tells us for 2 reasons God allowed this. On the first hand, to test them, whether they would be obedient to him, whether they would listen to his voice. And secondly, to train a new generation up for war. So it did 2 things, because these people did not fight with Joshua in the battles. They were now a young generation growing up. But by the end of the Judges, they failed the test completely. And these people no longer know who their God is. So by the time we kick off our story here, they don't know their God. As a nation, they've completely forgotten that they have a king who really reigns over them. And so we kick off on that first page with a story of 2 families. And the first family is a family that's torn by jealousy. And we saw this story so many times in the book of Genesis. It's so predictable, actually. Elkanah married 2 wives. And the one's womb is closed, and the other one is open. And so there's jealousy between the 2 of them. And year after year, as the family, they would go to Jerusalem, or not to Jerusalem at that time, to the temple or to the tabernacle. And they would go and bring sacrifices to God as a family. And they would have a meal together. And year after year, Peninnah would make fun, would mock Hannah because she had no children. And as the portions were given out around the table with a sacrifice, it would break her heart every time that she doesn't have a child to give a portion to. And this particular year, she went into the tabernacle early in the morning, and she started crying and praying out to God with just her lips moving, no words being heard. And the priest came to her and said, "How long will you keep up your drinking?" Assuming that she's drunk. And she says, "I'm not drunk. My heart is just broken. And I'm really petitioning God for a desperate need." And he blesses her and says, "May God give you your heart's desire. May God bless you." And she gets up comforted. She's got faith in her heart that this will take place. And sure enough, a year later, she has a boy called Samuel. And when he was old enough, she brought him to the temple because she made a promise that day to God and says, "If you give me a son, I will sacrifice the son to you. I will give the son into your service for the rest of his life." And she fulfilled her promise. And how difficult it must have been, because it's her only son at that time. And yet, she brought him. And year after year, she would go, as they went and brought sacrifices at Shiloh, and she would bring him a new tunic. And the boy grew up. And it says this beautiful phrase. It says, "And the boy grew in favor with God and with man." And then came a particular day where this boy started to hear God's voice. But what we sometimes forget is that God already at that time spoke to Eli through a prophet. God sent him a prophet and he warned him. And he says, "Why do you honor your sons greater than me? You do not discipline your sons when they do all these horrible things, seemingly in service of me in the temple." Because these boys would come, and when the sacrifices were brought in the temple, they would come and they would demand a better piece. They would want the steak of the sacrifice. Because normally, as God instructed it in the book of Leviticus, it would be thrown in a pot after the meat is burned off, and then with a 3-pronged fork. That's the only time we hear of a 3-pronged fork in the Bible. It's never to do with the devil. They would stick it in the pot, and whatever piece of meat would come up, that would be the priest's portion. So it would be a random decision. But by that time, it's boiled already. And they wanted it raw because they wanted it like a braai, like every good boer. And they would demand it. And if the people would say, "No, please wait until the fat is burned off," then they would say, "Give it or we'll take it by force." And in that way, they despised God's sacrifices. More than that, they slept with a woman at the gates of the temple. So they absolutely had no regard for who they were serving in the temple. And God says, "Eli, you are honoring your sons higher than me because you do not discipline them in these things. And therefore, you and your sons will all die on the same day. And nobody from your family will serve in the temple for the generations to come." And remember this one, because many years later we're going to see this being fulfilled in the time of David. And so by the time that night comes, that the boy Samuel is lying on his bed and he hears a voice, "Samuel, Samuel." He gets up and he goes to Eli and he says, "Yes, you've called me." He says, "No, I have not called you. Go back to bed, please." And a second time, he hears the voice and he comes and says, "Uncle Eli, here I am. You've called me." And by that time, it's probably, "No, I have not called you. Go back to bed." And the third time that he came up and he says to Uncle Eli, "You've called me, here I am." He says, he suddenly realized this is God speaking to the boy. And so he sent him back to bed and he said to him, "Go back to bed. And if you hear this voice calling you again, then answer, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And I truly do not think this boy fell asleep again. Eh? Uncle Eli is saying, God is speaking to me. An audible voice. And he lied there, and sure enough, God's voice came, and he answered as Eli told him. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And the first words that he hears is that prophetic word. I'm going to kill both Hophni and Phinehas on the same day, and so also Eli for all the sins that they have committed. What a hard word for a young boy to hear about the man that's practically been his father in this temple, the man that he's been serving. And so it says he lied awake until the morning came, and then got up and, as his habit was, opened the doors to the temple. And Uncle Eli came around and says, Samuel, what did God say to you? And I don't think he didn't want to tell him. But Eli said, don't keep to me anything from what the Lord said to you. And so he told him. And Eli's reply is, he is the Lord. Let him do as he sees fit. And then a battle came with the Philistines, and the moment that this would be fulfilled. They were losing the battle at that time, and so they thought, let's get God into the battle. And so they sent a message and said, bring the Ark of the Covenant. And the two priests, Hophni and Phinehas, were with the Ark of the Covenant as it brought, that wooden box covered with gold with a cherubim on top, with a mercy seat on top. And they brought this into the battle thinking that this is a lucky charm. Surely God is with us. They're playing Pokemon, right? They're adding powers by bringing their lucky charms into the battle. And it completely turned on them when this lucky charm came into the battlefield. The people of Israel cried out because they thought, here comes the victory. God is in our midst. And because they cried out so loudly, the Philistines on the other side of the battlefield said to one another, what is happening? And somebody comes and tells them, God is in their midst. That is the God who came down with all the plagues and destroyed Egypt. That's the God who led them through the Red Seas. These are the Philistines speaking to one another. And then they said, nothing like this has ever happened. Be brave, Philistines, and fight like real men. Today is the day that you better stand up. And so they rush into the battle and they destroy the Israelites. Who feared God more that day? They didn't know their God anymore. They didn't know how to live with him or how to live for him. And sure enough, the Ark of the Covenant was captured that day by the Philistines, and Hophni and Phinehas died. And when a messenger from the battlefield ran back home to Eli, he heard the noise because he was pretty blind at that time, and he was a heavy man sitting on a stool outside the gate. And as he heard the commotion, he asked, what's happening? What's happening? Bring me news from the battlefield. And they said, your 2 sons have died. And the ark was taken by the Philistines. And when he heard that, he fell back on his chair and he broke his neck. And the word of the Lord was fulfilled. And his one son's daughter, who was pregnant at the time, heard the news about her husband and about the ark being captured. And in that moment, birth pains come on her, and the child is born. And she called the child Ichabod while she was dying, giving birth to him. And Ichabod meaning the glory of God has departed, because the ark of God is taken out of the nation. But what's such a contrasting thing in this story is what it's about to take place. The Israelites do not know God, but God still loves them. And God is still absolutely for them. So the ark is now in enemy territory. And it's first taken to a small little town called Ashdod. And it's brought into a temple of their god called Dagon. Bug spray? And yeah, it works. I think prayer will also work. So they're in the temple. The ark is now standing in front of their God. They're saying, we've added strength to ourselves. We've captured their God. And when they came to the temple the next morning, their idol lied flat on its face in front of the ark. And they were all shocked and commotion. And the priest of the temple came and put the thing back up. And the next morning they came in, their idol were flat on his face before God. Except then his head was chopped off and both his hands as well. And such a plague of rats came into this town and of tumors on the people. And anxiety gripped their hearts. Fear came into the town that they said, we cannot have this thing with us anymore. Send it on. And they sent it on to Goth, where later Goliath will come from. And when it came there, the same plague hit them. Rats all over the show, tumors on the people, and anxiety. And they said, we don't want this thing anymore. Pass it on. And it went on to Ekron. And when it came to the next village of the Philistines, the people ran out from the village and says, please do not bring the ark to us. Now, this is a golden box. This is a treasure. All right? This is not just a something. You want this thing, man, even if it's just to melt it down. They just, don't bring it, please, please. They were so filled with fear. And so the 5 leaders of the Philistines had to come together, the 5 kings, and say, what are we going to do with this thing? We've got it. What do we do with it now? And so they got their sorcerers and said, tell us, what do we need to do? And they said these powerful words. Do not harden your hearts like Pharaoh and the Egyptians did back then. Isn't it powerful? When it says in the book of Exodus, God says, I'm going to make a great name for myself. He did it. This is hundreds of years later, and still the Philistines are recounting those things. They said, don't be like them, guys. And so they said, all right, tell you what we do. We're going to get a new cart. We're going to put this thing on the cart, and then we're going to get 2 cows who have calves. And we're going to tie up the calves back in the stall, and then we'll yoke them up to the cart. But don't send him back empty-handed. Make a little box, and in the box put 5 golden tumors. Don't know how that would have looked. Not great artmanship. And 5 golden rats, representing these plagues that came on you. Put it on the ark, on the cart next to the ark, and then see what happens. What's going to happen? The cows are going to go back home, right? They don't want to leave their calves. As soon as they hoofed them up, these cows started walking to Israel. And all along as they walked, they lowed, complaining. They don't want to go this way. But there's some angel leading them down the path. And it came across the border to the Israelites. And God, without the lifting of one Israelite hand or army, brought his own ark back home. And these lords followed behind it to see what's going to happen. And as it crossed the border, they said, all right, there it goes. The Israelites have it. They turned around. They went back home. God is the king of Israel. He is the king of Israel. That's how the story opens up. That's what he's emphasizing. So when they start asking for a king one of these days, they forgot that they had a king, and they can never have a better one. But the story moves on. Just how the weekend's going to go for us is, I've actually forgot my hourglass, because I figured we'll tell a story for an hour, and just before bedtime kicks in, we'll quickly have a break. And then we'll tell a story for an hour, and then we'll have a break. All right. So if I see the heads nodding, I'll throw an hourglass at you or something. And so the monarchy begins. Now, Samuel, at this time, is the last judge. While he's not in the book of the Judges, he is the last judge of Israel. He's both now a priest, he's a prophet, and he's a judge. So he's actually a pretty unique character. He's more like a Deborah. I think she's the only one that sort of fulfills that kind of role or that kind of office for Israel. And he sees some powerful battles. Sometime later, the Philistines attacked again, and he called the people to a revival and says, come, Israelites, come back to our God. Come bring all your idols that you've gathered up and all of these bad habits that you've learned from the people worshiping Baal and Asherah. Bring it together on a pile and let's burn it in God's presence. And as this massive revival meeting is taking place, the news comes. The Philistines are on the way. They're about to come and attack us. And at that time, they're not ready. They're there with their families. They're having a church service, as it be, a massive one, but that's the kind of the state that they're in. And so they come to Samuel and says, please, you better plead before God now, because we are not able to face the Philistines at this moment. And so he does. He prays to God, and God comes over the Philistines with a loud thunder that scares them out of their wits, and with hail that rains down on them, fighting on behalf of the Israelites. And the battle is won. But shortly afterwards, Samuel is now getting old, and his sons are not following in his ways, and quite clearly because he's traveling around too much. It's interesting. It says Samuel traveled between 3 cities every year on a cycle. 3 months there, 3 months there, 3 months there, back home, 3 months there. So he's pretty much your absent dad. And his sons did not grow up like him. So when he started to put them in positions of judging the people or things like that, they started taking bribes. They were not honest. And so the Israelites came because of that to Samuel and says, please, appoint a king for us. We want a king like all the other nations. And it broke Samuel's heart. He came to God and says, God, this is what they're saying. And God says, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They're asking for a human king instead of me. They're missing what they have. They want to be like all the others. Before we look into that then, just read there in Deuteronomy chapter 17. You've got it in your manual. Because God is not caught off guard by this. It's not like he says, oops, that's not in my plan. He always knew that this was going to happen. It says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God is choosing. So we're going to come back to this list later on when we look at Samuel's life, or Solomon's life. Secondly, he must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. Thirdly, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way. It's very clear instructions, right? Next, he must not take in many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Who comes to mind? He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Who comes to mind? When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. Isn't that an interesting twist in it? Not consider himself better. So it's sort of when Jesus says to his disciples, if somebody is to be the leader over you, he is to be your servant. That's what God wants, right? That's not the picture of a king we normally get. And then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So that's the promise that the Lord gave. Now, God said, warn them. We're now on page 3. When they came and asked for a king, said, please give us a king like all the others. God said to Samuel, tell the people what the king will do. So they shouldn't go into this blindly. Tell them what the king will claim as his rights. And so he listed it out over there. He said, your sons will serve with his chariots and horses and run in front of his chariots, be assigned as his commanders of thousands and fifties, plow his ground and reap his harvest, make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Do you still want a king? Yes. All right, let's go on. Your daughters will Be his perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves. Take a tenth of your grain and all of your vintage. Do you still want a king? You hear what God is saying to them? Do you really want this? I mean, isn't this a better deal? Do you really want this? And then he says, take your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys for his own, and take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourself will become his slaves. Do you still want this? And the people replied, yes. Give us a king anyway. We want one like all the other nations. And so he says, all right, go back home. Let's see what the Lord's going to do. And then comes the story of the first royal family. We meet a boy who is with a servant in the field looking for his dad's donkeys. He's from the least of the tribes of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin. At the end of the book of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin came this close from being completely wiped out, because it was that tribe that were very much like Sodom and Gomorrah. So there was a civil war against them, and they nearly got wiped out. So it's a very, very small tribe. But this man is physically a head taller than anybody else in the nation. Hey? Really interesting. A hoogspringman. And he stands out a head above the rest. And at this time, he's looking for his dad's donkeys, and it's been going on for a few days now. And it came to the point where he said to his servant, let's go home. We're not finding these donkeys. We're far away from home already. And Dad's going to stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about us. Let's go home. And the servant actually pops up and says, wait, we're close to this town where the man of God is often. Let's see, maybe he can tell us where the donkeys are. He's speaking about Samuel. And Saul says, man, what are we going to give him? We don't have anything with him. And interestingly, the servant offers and says, I think it was a belt and a coin. We've got this. Let's give him this. Because you're just not going to rock up and ask that kind of a favor without a reward. So he says, all right, let's give it a go. And they go to the village, and as they get to the gate of the village, they ask somebody, we're looking for the seer, which is in those days what they called a prophet, the guy that could see into the spirit. And he says, oh, you're in luck. There he comes now, walking out of the village. And he's going to a meeting with the elders outside the village for a special festival meal. And as Samuel is walking towards them, it says, the Lord spoke in Samuel's ear and said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about yesterday when I said, there's a man that's going to come looking for his dad's donkeys. So he walks up to Saul without Saul saying a word and says, your dad's donkeys, it's been found already, and your dad is just worried about you now. But don't you worry, come with me to the meal that's been prepared, because there's a special place for you right there, set apart. And all of these people will not start eating unless you come and join us. How will you feel? What? Is this like a different universe I'm just walking into, you know? I'm just blown away. These words of knowledge just flying. And it's about to get even more amped. So he comes to this meal. He sits down at a special place presented for him. He gets a bigger portion than anybody else at the table. He doesn't know any of these people. What's happening? After the meal, he gets up, and Samuel takes him back to his house, and then he says, send your servant off ahead, because I need to have a conversation with you. And they get onto the roof of Samuel's house, and he takes out a flask of oil, and he pours it out over his head. He says, the Lord is anointing you as king of Israel. And now listen up, because I'm about to tell you what's going to happen with you the rest of the day. You're going to walk off from here. You're going to come down the road, and you're going to meet, don't know in which order, but you're going to meet people carrying food. You're going to ask them, because they're about to take that as a sacrifice to God in a particular place, and they're going to give you some of the food. And then you're going to walk on, you're going to meet a Philistine garrison heading up this way. And then you're going to walk on, you're going to meet a school of the prophets, and the Spirit of God is going to come on you, and you're going to prophesy. and then you're going to come back home and then do what the Lord tells you to do. And he walks back, and everything happens exactly as Samuel told him. He walks in a fulfilled prophecy that entire day. And he comes home, and the donkeys are found, and his dad asks him, where were you, what happened? And it says he said nothing about what the prophet said. I think he was just blown away. What do I do with this? I wasn't looking for this. Nothing. I was not running for an election. Nothing. And he just lived for a while. And then Samuel called together all the elders of Israel to a big gathering. And they're all there, all in their tribes and families. And Kish and his family is there as well. And then as they're at this big meeting, they say, all right, tribe of Benjamin, come forward. Out of the tribe of Benjamin, clan of so-and-so, come forward. Out of the clan of so-and-so, Kish, you and your family, come forward. And then finally, where's Saul? Anybody seen Saul? Did your son come? Is he here? And they find him hiding behind the baggage. And they bring him out and say, this is your king. And understandably, there's some guys there that just reject him and said, no, he's not our king. It's not what we want. But interestingly, it says, and the Lord moved powerful men's hearts, courageous men, to follow him. And they went back home with him. So the Lord moved people around him and said, you go. This is my king. So right from the start, the question is, was Saul set up for success? Or was he set up for failure? Was he doomed to fail as a king? Because we know what's going to happen, right? He was set up absolutely for success. Right from the start, God gave him everything that was needed for him to reign and for his family to continue to reign, to be the monarchy of Israel. And it would have been that perfect story that all through the Bible rings true. The least becomes the greatest. It would have been so beautiful. So it was Saul's choice to walk the road that he's about to road. And what happened? Saul's rise was firstly a private anointing there on the roof, and then a public anointing there in front of everybody. But then he went back home and nothing happened. Until one moment, oh, you've got Saul. There we go. He was listening. I'm sort of caught off guard. But otherwise we're going to run out of space. And that'll be good. Our first king is up. And then he went back home and nothing happened. Until finally, the Philistines came. The Amorites. Was the Amorites. And they came and besieged a town called Jabesh Gilead. And they were quite isolated. It's on the other side of the Jordan River. It's sort of more on the Goth side of things. And they were told, listen, you guys, we're going to take you in and we're going to destroy the entire city. And so they sent out messages to the Ammonites and says, please have grace on us. Please, please, can we make a peace treaty with you? And he says, all right. The king of the Ammonites says, this is the agreement. If you guys come out here and allow us to gorge out the right eye of every male in this town, then we can have a peace treaty. Imagine the fear that struck them. What are we going to do? And so interestingly, they send out a message that says, please give us 7 days to ask around if anybody will come and help us. And obviously the Ammonites must have thought, nobody's going to come and help you. There's nobody, all right? And so they agreed. They said, sure, ask around. We'll give you 7 days grace. And they sent a message around, and this message somewhere reached Saul. And he was working in the field at that time, plowing. And when he heard about this, it says the Spirit of the Lord came on Saul. And he took his ox and he chopped him into pieces. And he sent the pieces all throughout the land of Israel. And he says, those who will not join me in this battle, your oxen will be made like this. Now, it's like saying in Malmesbury, here's a chopped up tractor. If you do not come to the battle, your tractor is going to become like this tractor. It's like the thing that runs the farm. It's a big deal. It's not just an animal, all right? And it says the fear of the Lord came on the Israelites, and they joined in the battle. And they sent a secret message off to the people of Jabez Gilead and says, tell them tomorrow morning you will surrender because we're coming to your salvation. And they sent out the message and says, all right, tomorrow morning we'll come and we'll give ourselves over and do with us what you want. And so the Ammonites obviously threw a party because there's going to be no battle. And in the thick of the night, the Israelites were on them and conquered them. And afterwards, they went and they conquered further some of the Ammonites. And so it's a massive, massive salvation for Israel. And at the end of this salvation, they bring Saul, obviously carrying him on the arms. Woohoo, here's our man. And then some of the people said, so who were those guys who did not want Saul as king? Bring them out now. We'll sort them out and their whole families as well. And Saul said, no. Come on. Let's go just and confirm the kingship. And all of Israel came and confirmed him as king. And now he's set solidly. He is now the king, accepted by the nations. It's demonstrated the Spirit of the Lord led this guy and worked through him on our behalf. Unfortunately, it's not going to keep that way because fear is one of his downfalls. Fear of man, that same thing that kept him behind the baggage, it's going to culminate to his destruction at the end of the day. So what happened was for most of Saul's reign, the Philistines were the big pain. And only in David's time they were sorted out. So battle after battle were fought against the Philistines. And in one of these battles, he had a pretty big army to begin with. But they just couldn't kick off the battle. And so he sent this message off to Samuel and says, Samuel, please, come and bring a sacrifice for us before we start off the battle. And Samuel said, I'll be there in so many days. And they're waiting, and they're waiting. And as they're waiting, some of Saul's guys start leaving one by one, just getting scared, going back home. And his army is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You can just feel the fear rising. Samuel, you better come. And the day comes that Samuel should have been there, and Samuel is not there. And so he decides, all right, to heck with this. I'm bringing the sacrifice. And as he stood up and he made the sacrifice ready, and the smoke just starts rising from the sacrifice, something that he should not have done. He's not a priest. At that moment, Samuel walks into the camp. Awkward. And Samuel walks up and says, what have you done? He says, well, you did not show up when you said you would show up. And the men were busy deserting me, so I had to do something. And he says, you have done a foolish thing. The Lord is going to reject you as king and choose somebody better instead. That's the first big warning that he receives from Samuel. He says, do not walk in fear. Do not walk in presumption. Walk in obedience. Anyway, they go on the battle, but there's another battle with the Philistines. And at this particular battle, the fear element is a bit worse. So the men are hiding in the caves, and it's going on week after week after week after week, and the Philistines are making a joke of them and saying, these rabbits, they're all hiding, Until at one moment, Samuel calls a man forward and says, a priest. He says, come and inquire of the Lord for me. What are we to do? And he's standing there and he's praying and he's asking of the Lord, probably with a sacrifice, something like that. And at this particular moment, Jonathan, Saul's son, is out with his armor bearer. They just thought, let's just stroll out the cave a bit, see what's happening. And he says to his armor bearer, you see these Philistines up there? Tell you what, the Lord can save by many or by few. So let's go and show ourselves to these guys. And if they should say, you guys, wait down there and we'll come and sort you out, then we'll know, all right, this is not from the Lord, let's withdraw. But if they should say, You guys, come up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Then we know that's a sign from God that we are to go and teach them a lesson. The Lord is going to give them over. And the armor bearer says, I'm with you. Do as you please. And so the two of them, just two men, come out of hiding, and there are all the Philistines on the hilltop in a much stronger position of the battle, much easier to throw them with stones or shoot them with arrows, do with them what they want. And there they are in this weak position, just two people. And sure enough, the Philistines call down, come up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Probably thinking, it's too much trouble to go down there for two Israelites. Let them come up here. And as they come up this hill, in a complete position of not being able to fight, these guys can just stab them down. It says, Jonathan cut them down with a sword, and his armor bearer came behind and sorted them out one by one by one. And in that short distance of just climbing up the hill, 20 Philistines already die. By the time that they come up on the hill, there's such a panic in the Philistine camp that the tumult is being heard by the Israelites still back in the cave inquiring of God. And at that moment, Saul is standing with this guy that's still inquiring of God, what is the will, what needs to happen? And he says, what's that tumult over there? Quickly, round up the men. Who's missing? They say, oh, Jonathan and his armor bearer are not here. And it happened quickly. By that time, I think there were only 600 men. That's not a big army to count. And then Saul just says, okay, stop inquiring of God. We better go. And they go, ready for the battle. And by the time that they go out, the tumult, the fear in the Philistine camp is just crazy. And these guys start running and they start chasing them down. Now understand what's happening here. This is just 600 Israelites. In that entire army at that time, there's only 2 swords. Because the Philistines were clever enough to kill all the blacksmiths in Israel. So that there was nobody to come and sharpen your sword. You had to walk across the border to have it sharpened. And if you sharpen it with a Philistine, you ain't getting it back. Jonathan and Saul were the only 2 guys with swords. So this is literally a picture of those old armies with a pitchfork over here and a shovel over here and a stick and a club, fighting these Philistines who have chariots and arrows and whatever else they could get. But they got the upper hand because God was fighting for them. And then, as they were going out this cave ready for the battle, Saul does another foolish thing. He shouts out to his guys, with Jonathan and the armor bearer not there, right? He shouts out, if anybody eats or drink anything today before this battle is finished, there'll be a curse on them. And off they go. And as they're fighting this battle that's now getting longer and longer, at one stage they're going through a forest. And in this forest there's the comb of honey. And Jonathan, passing by, takes a stick, puts it in, just on the run, and licks it. Keep chasing. And the guy next to him says, did you not hear what your dad said? You're not allowed to eat or drink anything until the end of this battle. There's a curse on you now. And Jonathan just says, but how foolish of Dad. Look, I've just lit up. Look at my eyes. I've just got energy, man. I've got a sugar rush. I'm ready to go again. He should have just not said that, and the army would have been so much stronger in this battle. And by the end of the battle, they've just captured so many of the animals of the Philistines that the guy starts killing it right there on the ground. They start eating it with the blood still in it. It's rough. These guys are hungry. They've probably been starved in the cave back there. And Saul says to the guys, what are you doing? Just wait. Don't eat it with the blood. You know what God said in the book of Leviticus, which is to his credit. He at least knows that much. He says, there's a big stone up here. Everybody, bring your animal, kill it here, slaughter it properly, and then go and braai. And they're bringing it up, and they're eating. And then again, Saul, undecisive, says to one of the priests, come up here. We need to inquire of God. What do we need to do? I think we still need to go and press through the night and really see this battle through. Or should we call it a night? And God doesn't answer. Interesting. They expect God to answer when they ask a question, eh? But God doesn't answer. And Saul knows there's something wrong. He says, all right, ask God, is it me and my family, or is it the guys that did something? And so God says, it's you and your family. And it's him and Jonathan standing there. He says, all right, ask God, or is it me or Jonathan that did something wrong? And it landed on Jonathan. And he says, my son, own up. What did you do? Jonathan said, but Dad, I just didn't hear what you said. I wasn't there. And so I just took a stick and I put it in the honey and I licked it. He says, all right, my son, I'm sorry, you must die. Does any of that sit right? This man has no wisdom. Eh? All throughout the day, you see him blundering through things. He's there, but it doesn't seem like the Spirit of God is operating through him. There's no wisdom. And so the army actually comes forward and says, not a chance. Jonathan will not be killed today. God has just brought a mighty victory through this man. How dare we kill the champion that God used today? And Saul relented. Said, all right. Interesting. Now, shortly after this, Samuel comes to him, and it's the last story before we close off now. Samuel comes, and he gives a clear instruction to Saul. He says, God says, go to the Amorites. I always mix the Amorites and the Amalekites. Go to the Amalekites, and you need to bring the wrath of God on them. You need to go and completely destroy this city with their king and all of their animals. None of them, none of them must survive, because God's judgment is on them. And it's for something particularly that they did. And Samuel got the instructions to Saul. It was very clear, very understandable. He says, right, I'll go. He got the army together. He went. God gave him success in the battle. And when they came back with a whole bunch of the best animals, and they came back with a king, Agag. And it's a nice trophy for Samuel now to walk in with. I've captured the king. And they meet Samuel on the way, and Samuel says, hi, Saul. Did you go and do what God says? Yes, I went and did what God says I needed to do. I went and completely destroyed the Amalekites. And so he says, well, what's the sound of the bleating of animals that I'm hearing? He says, no, the men decided they wanted to bring some of the best animals back and sacrifice it to God. All right? And what is the king doing here? And at that moment, Samuel just said to him, does the Lord desire more obedience or sacrifice? In what does he delight more? So you want to bring sacrifices to him, but you did not obey him. You did not do what he said you needed to do. Today, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you, and he's given it to somebody better than yourself. Okay? And there he lost it out of disobedience to God. And it was the final blow. And at that moment, Samuel turned around to walk away. It's done. He's no longer the king. And Saul grabbed onto his tunic as he walked away, and a piece of it tore off. And he said to him, like that, the Lord has just torn away the kingdom from your hand. And interesting, Saul is not falling on his knees. He's not begging for forgiveness. He's not repenting. What does he ask? He says, no, but Samuel, please don't go. Just come with me to the sacrifice that I'm about to bring and honor me in front of the men. Doesn't it so clearly show his heart? Hey? No repentance. Just don't let me look bad in front of my guys. Please. And Samuel actually relented. He says, I'll come. And then when he came, Agag was standing there thinking, the wrath is over, the battle is over, I'm saved, I'm brought back here. And Samuel said, as you left woman childless, so also your mom will be left childless. And Samuel himself struck the king down. Says, this needs to be done. God says it needs to be done. And it's actually for me such a striking picture. Up until that point, I've never considered Samuel a man of war. And yet in that moment, it's just, this is the right thing that needs to be done. It needs to be obeyed. God, there it's done. And from that day on, Samuel never saw the face of Saul again, which is quite incredible because he is reigning for several years to come still. And I always thought it's funny because only when he was dead and the witch of Endor called him up, his spirit saw him again, but never again in the flesh. So we're going to stop the story over there. And just around the table, I want you to speak a bit about just the story you've heard. And somewhere in your conversation, when it gets a bit quieter or whatever else, would you just page back to page number, where are we? Page number 2. And there on the right-hand side, I want you just to consider those 2 questions up there. The one question asking, did God ever abdicate his throne to the kings of Israel and Judah? And secondly, just consider briefly the 3 offices, the difference between a prophet, a judge, and a king. And really just between the bunch of you, speak about that quickly.